Hello.
Hey, Hussein, how's it going?
Fine, thanks. How are you?
Good. It'd be funny if it's just you and I. Oh, there's someone else.
Hey, good morning.
Good morning. So I just wanted to, I'll stop sharing. I just wanted to test. Can you see my slide deck view?
Yep.
Nice to meet you, Ricardo.
Great to meet you, Craig. Let's give it a little bit of time, maybe like 2 minutes, or
Sure.
so that some people join or allow them to join.
Are you the chair for TAG-Runtime? Is that the right word to use, chair?
Yep, exactly. I'm one of the co-chairs. We have two more, so I'm one of them. But I've been primarily running these meetings because some of the other co-chairs have actually been busy with their work.
Yeah.
But,
I'd love to get involved more. I guess this is like, I'm glad Elena put us in touch because it would be great if I could help out in any way possible.
Yeah, that'd be great. And also, if you think there's also a group who is interested in working under the CNCF, we can create working groups under this tag.
Okay.
Yeah, and then the CNCF can facilitate like meetings and communication in maybe Slack, and so different ways of helping the communities to move the projects or whatever the working group is working on forward.
Cool. Great. That's cool. I was curious if did Elena putting us in touch, is it just a coincidence that it happens to line up with K3s's first annual review in the CNCF, or is that sort of like an intentional part of this?
I don't think I had any relationship. At least I don't know anything about that, but
Okay.
yeah, maybe Elena has.
Yeah, I thought maybe.
Check with her, but I mean, nothing has been mentioned to me, but I think we try to engage different projects and try to get them to come over to present and give an update, or
Right.
trying to understand what the project is, and maybe trying to see where it can go from
Right.
its current state forward.
Got it. Yeah, it's good timing because it's sort of what I present here is kind of pretty similar to what I can add for, what we will submit for the annual review.
Annual review. Yeah, that's great. Yeah. And I think it helps, with if you want to get to the next stage, which is incubation. Also helps, maybe some can get a little some feedback. And all right, I'm gonna post the link to the meeting. So go ahead and please add yourself there as an attendee today.
Okay.
And as soon as Craig, you're ready, we can go and get started.
Sure. Okay, I'm ready. So I will share my screen. Okay, there we go. All right, so yeah, this is just kind of, I put together this slide deck just to help me talk through sort of the various bits and pieces of K3s. Stop me at any time, feel free to ask questions. Otherwise, I'll just jump right into it.
Sounds good.
I'm sorry?
Sounds good.
Oh, okay, cool. Yeah, so for starters, I thought I'd just kind of list out the maintainers here. Currently, all maintainers are part of SUSE, which is the company that acquired Rancher, and Rancher was the, where K3s was born. So we have contributors certainly outside of SUSE, but all the maintainers currently are at this company. With me today, I asked Hussein to join as sort of so I'm a manager, so I don't do the day-to-day coding. Hussein is one of the main developers on K3s, so I asked him to join in case there is any deeper technical questions that I couldn't answer. And I noticed Brian Downs is on as well. Thanks for joining, Brian. So just at a super high level, I thought I'd just level set what K3s is, because I wasn't really sure of the audience and how familiar you all would be with K3s. So, excuse me. First off, it's a certified Kubernetes distribution. Every minor release, we submit passing conformance test results to the repo where that's maintained to to ensure we're staying in line with the being a certified distribution. One of its key features is that it's easy to install and operate anywhere. It brings all of its own dependencies. By that, I mean sort of like the lower level OS and runtime type dependencies. The first one that pops to mind is IP tables, because it has caused problems for us over the last year as the implementation shifted under the covers on various OSs. It's one simple command to install and run. So basically we have this install script and the super easy, super fast way that we say you can install it is basically just run that install script. It'll pull down K3s. K3s itself is a self-extracting binary that just kind of extracts itself onto your system and gets up and running. We target x86 64, ARM v7, and ARM v8. I think a lot of our early adoption was due to that sort of priority we put on supporting ARM because we saw a lot of hobbyists, folks running Raspberry Pis, that sort of thing, wanting to run Kubernetes on those small devices, and K3s was a good fit. And we put effort into ensuring it runs pretty consistently. A few times we've actually identified some upstream issues with ARM support just through our validation and testing that we do there. And the other major feature is it's optimized for a smaller footprint. We combine components into a single binary and a few processes. So when you think about Kubernetes, you have like the API server, the scheduler, the controller manager, those sorts of things. We run all of those Go processes that would typically be deployed as independent components inside of a single process. They're effectively, subroutines. And that cuts down on memory overhead. It's really good for single node clusters. Obviously, this isn't what you want everywhere. This is why K3s is sort of different. That's not how you would always want to run Kubernetes, but it works for those like small single node edge type deployments, works really well for those.
A question.
Sure.
The kubelet is the same or is it different from the upstream?
So the kubelet, it is the upstream kubelet for sure. Both the process you launch with K3s is sort of like the K3s server process or the K3s agent process. And then those, we have two types of nodes, server nodes or agent nodes if you're doing a multi-node cluster. And so the kubelet is launched for whether it's a server node or an agent node. Hussein, does the kubelet run as an embedded process, like the API server does, or is it spun out? Is it launched?
It launches as an embedded process as well as other components.
Right. So yeah, it's the same code, but it's launched in an entirely different way from upstream Kubernetes.
Got it.
Yeah.
Okay, so you have a concept of server and agents. The server is more like the control plane components, and then the agent is more like the kubelet component. That's my guess, right?
Yeah, and I'm realizing I didn't include an architecture diagram that might have helped show that, but yeah, that's the idea. But our server nodes, they'll run the entire control plane plus the kubelet. So the server node by default, we don't K3s, because like our main use case or one of our main use cases is single node clusters. You just launch the server and you can run workloads on that node as well. So we don't taint the node or kind of prevent workloads from running on it in any way. But if you want to have a separated control plane, you can launch dedicated agent nodes, which are the equivalent of workers, and then you can choose to taint the server nodes to keep those purely control plane.
Got it. Okay. Awesome.
Cool. So another thing that we do from an optimization standpoint is we drop the optional in-tree storage and cloud providers. This cuts down significantly on the binary size because all those are vendor specific, right? And so then they end up pulling in sort of a whole tree of dependencies for the SDKs related to those vendors. And the K3s model or the use, one reason for doing that is when the expectation is a lot of the use cases you're running on the edge or on devices like Pis, and so those are less necessary. And then of course upstream Kubernetes is slowly moving towards out of tree for both of those things. So this sort of aligns with the the future goal of out of tree for both storage and cloud providers. And then it's this last one. So one of the big, I would say, features of K3s is allowing for other databases than etcd. This is accomplished through sort of a shim layer that we call Kine, K-I-N-E. And Darren Shepard wrote it. It stands for Kine is not etcd, so it's kind of like a recursive name. But what it allows us to do is basically it kind of presents the pieces of the etcd API that Kubernetes is expecting, and then allows for different drivers to implement that. So by default, when you deploy K3s, just on however you deploy it, just do it in the simplest way. It's actually not backed by etcd, it's backed by SQLite. That is important because SQLite makes trade-offs that makes it run, makes it optimal for those single node or small node use cases. It's lighter weight in memory, lighter weight in, writing to the file system. So that kind of has a huge impact on performance. But it comes with a trade-off of it's not HA, right? So we do have embedded etcd support. So if you kind of want that full-fledged cluster, fully HA, then you can switch over to etcd and kind of get all those typical benefits. And then one other thing we support is external SQL, which we have found to be actually a really good fit for sort of enterprise and cloud-based use cases, because you can, for example, stand up, HA K3s server nodes backed by MySQL RDS, so basically you're offloading all your database operations to AWS in that case, if it's RDS, and but still getting all the benefits of HA.
Have you had any end users install 2 K3s servers or installations for HA purposes? I'm wondering if, using something like SQLite, right? So yeah, because maybe your file system can get corrupted or multiple things can happen to that node. I'm wondering if there's some end users that maybe are thinking about having an HA, not with like etcd or an external SQL, but something with just 2, say, Raspberry nodes side by side, and then if one of them fails, then actually the other one can take over the workload.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And we've done a lot of iterations on this, and our earliest attempts was to actually use DQLite, which is like distributed SQLite. It's a project that I think is maintained by folks at Canonical. Ultimately, it just was not as mature as etcd, and so we thought that had promise, but it's the same basic. DQLite was the same basic concept as etcd. You need quorum, so you need 3 nodes, and all that. So the truth is, if you're using SQLite, there's a number of other considerations and trade-offs you have to make, and it's sort of, you need a orchestration layer above the K3s, the single node K3s cluster, or the single control plane node K3s cluster to account for this. So for example, you might just have to, have a mechanism in place to nuke and pave. And I've talked to some folks that I work with that are sort of more on the field side, and they've experimented with sort of like just kind of like writing in a leader follower, kind of just piping SQLite over to another node. But that's not fully supported, is more of just like an experimental thing.
Got it.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm thinking that problem may come up in sometime in the future, right?
Yeah. Yep, I agree. Okay, I'll move on from here unless you have any more questions. Okay. So we like to talk about sort of the different things you can do with it. Obviously, I talked about edge and ARM devices a lot. Another use case that has emerged is CI/CD. So K3s spinning up pretty quickly and using relatively few resources enables a lot of scenarios where sort of like just in your CI pipeline, your application pipeline, you can spin up K3s, deploy your pod into it or your Helm chart into it, do some integration tests, and then tear it all down. And it adds little overhead to the entire process, but lets you get sort of another level of I guess CI that you want, that would be, not that you can't do it, but is harder to accomplish in other ways. Another place we've seen it sort of gain traction is on the desktop. So a cool project that came out of the community, we didn't really kick it off or anything, is K3D. The D there, I think originally stood for Docker. It might, maybe eventually it might just stand for desktop if sort of the need for Docker is removed. But the idea with K3D is, you can use Docker. It has its own CLI, but behind the scenes, it's using Docker containers to spin up multi-node clusters. So it's pretty good for sort of power users who need to test Kubernetes HA scenarios and things like that for their applications. They can have multiple clusters up and running on their desktop. Each cluster can have multiple nodes. So it's just sort of like a little CLI for deploying K3s clusters inside of Docker containers. And then Rancher Desktop is a newish project. Obviously, by the name, you can guess it's it's fully open source, but it's maintained by the folks at Rancher, SUSE Rancher. And then that is sort of like seeks the sort of simpler experience of give me a GUI that just gives me a simple single node Kubernetes cluster. I'm not a power user. I'm just a developer focusing on my app, but I do need to deploy it into Kubernetes to test it locally. And so that's just sort of that very simple interface into a single node cluster you can run locally. And then finally, the typical cloud and data center deployments for K3s, which is when I talked about, pointing, whether you're using etcd or pointing it at an external SQL data store, we see that, production use cases for that all the time.
For CI/CD, have you seen different use cases from, say, something like Minikube and Kind?
No, I think I think it overlaps a lot with like Kind. I think Kind kind of does the same thing. Minikube, I guess, I don't know if Minikube gets used as much in that scenario, but I would say there's a lot of overlap with Kind for that use case.
Got it.
Okay. So I'm not sure if you want to go into this or not. You mentioned sort of just the community around it. So I thought I thought I'd talk about this for a second. Did my view switch over to looking at dev stats or no?
Yep.
Okay, cool. So this is just talking through contributors. By and large, there's sort of the main contributors are all SUSE, formerly Rancher employees. And then there's, very much a long tail of folks who, just submit patches here and there to address, their specific issue. It's pretty typical for open source community, I think. I won't scroll through all of this, but I think it's a pretty typical long tail scenario where, the vast majority of heavy contributors are employed by SUSE, and then, I keep saying it, long tail of folks who do other things. One person who's been really contributing a lot is Akihiro, who has made a lot of strides in rootless support. So that's kind of been their thing, not only in K3s, but in Containerd, and I think upstream Kubernetes as well. So it's good to have those contributions coming in.
Do you have any plans to? Well, you have Trivago there, which is somebody.
So this is the I will try. That's Torsten. He's the K3d developer and creator, and he doesn't work directly for SUSE, but he does have a working relationship with us. So that's almost. And Hussein is actually, so all of the top 10, I would say, are, even though Torsten isn't directly employed by SUSE, I wouldn't say that's fair to say it's fully an independent company either, because he does contracting work for us. But yeah, to answer your question, I think that's going to be one of our big goals for the next year, is to figure out how to get, effectively a maintainer from a different company, to just even that out. I know that's an important part of ensuring the community is healthy and the project is healthy.
Yep. Yeah. So I think this sort of comes up in the incubation stage when you're going for, and then definitely comes up for graduation, right? So the CNCF has had cases where some of the projects haven't been able to graduate because they've only had a single company as the main backer. Right?
Yeah, that makes sense. And my assumption has been that we would want to have that before applying for incubation. Is that true? Or is it more once you're in incubation, that's when you start focusing on it?
I'm thinking that it might be better to have that before you apply for incubation.
Right.
But see, when you go for incubation, you need to get a TOC sponsor.
Yep.
And having multiple maintainers will help with that. But I'm not really sure if it's the conditions, one of the conditions for incubation.
Yeah, I didn't see it explicitly in the list of conditions, but honestly, I think maybe in a previous iteration of the conditions, I thought I saw it there, but when I was looking earlier this week, I didn't see it. But yeah, I'll find that out as part of our yearly review anyway. And I'm kind of putting, my view on it. It would be better to have it going into it. So we don't intend to go for incubation this year. The goal would be sort of to use, this upcoming year, to get sort of our house in order around, making sure we can achieve incubation in the following year.
And yeah, one thing that really comes up in incubation is number of end users.
Right.
So if you have, say, 5 end users with a story behind them and why it was really useful, and usually the TOC sponsor goes out and reaches out to some of those end users and does a little bit of validation as to what the story is behind why they're using the project. And yeah, and I guess that person comes back to the TOC with the feedback.
Yeah, and I noticed that, and it's K3s certainly has a lot of usage, but I wouldn't say from an open source community standpoint, we've been tracking end users. And so that's definitely sort of a thing for the next year, is to sort of start reaching out to the end users and asking them to commit to saying, yeah, we're users of this, and sharing their story and stuff. So I'm actually looking forward to that. I think that'd be fun. Working at SUSE, I know there's users that are paying customers of SUSE, but I think we want to kind of, keep a distinct line there as much as possible.
Right. Yeah.
So this other slide, I just thought, or this other graph is interesting, just from a standpoint of just checking out issues. We have a pretty consistent churn of, opening and closing between 2 and 3 issues pretty much, I think daily. So we see a lot of churn there. And this spike here corresponds to us enabling Stalebot, which has been very helpful for the maintainers to kind of cut down on just, all the issues that have been open. I think Stalebot can be somewhat controversial, but it's been helpful to just managing our backlog and understanding what remains important. So I don't know if this is particularly interesting, but it's good information to look at from just a project health standpoint, I think. Yep, so this jumps around. Okay, so these are sort of things we've done. Again, my frame of mind of this is prepping for the annual review with the CNCF anyway. So this is sort of things we've done over the last year. I broke this out into features and then sort of non-feature things, which I called keeping our house in order, which just ties to maintenance and then also community type stuff. A big focus in the second half of this year, and I think going into next year, is improved testing. So we introduced a framework and documentation for adding different types of tests. From a community standpoint, we've started publishing sort of weekly status and accomplishment reports. That's been nice just for transparency, so folks can get a better idea of what's going on. Minor thing, but we enabled GitHub discussions to help distinguish between questions and issues, because a lot of the issues that are opened in our repo are really just, how do I do X, or I don't know how to configure this to get it to work properly. So that's been helpful for managing community interactions. We've made some contributor quality of life improvements by introducing issue and PR templates, and as I mentioned before, turning on Stalebot. And we did all that while maintaining cadence with upstream Kubernetes, which is how we seek to release. So, every time Kubernetes does a patch release, we try and get a K3s patch release out shortly thereafter. And then same thing with the minor releases. So we kind of stake our features as much as we can to releasing along with the corresponding Kubernetes minor releases.
One question that I have is about the CVE patches or the minor patches for Kubernetes.
Mm-hmm.
How do you actually sync those up with the upstream? I mean, do you have a single executable, right? So you actually have to go in the code and understand what the patch was about and actually patch it up at the code level?
Yeah, so we have a repository that is a fork of the Kubernetes code base, and it has, it's Kubernetes plus our patches, and then every time Kubernetes releases, we pull in that code. And the vast majority of time for any of the patch releases, whether they're CVE releases or just the normal monthly patch releases, that applies very easily and cleanly. And then where we tend to have a little more legwork is on the first, like 122.0. That's where we kind of have to do some deeper thinking about, here's sort of the change set and how does it impact us. But from the CVE and just general monthly patching standpoint, we've gotten pretty good at pulling in that, basically updating our code base and then pulling that into K3s, updating our Kubernetes code base and then pulling that into the broader K3s code base. And we also we tend to have to do this not just for Kubernetes, but the other, it's all in one, right? So we're also packaging and deploying Containerd. So we have a similar relationship with that code base as well. And then what helps is being on sort of the security sort of early distribution lists for these projects, we can kind of have a heads up of when those CVEs are dropping and prepping for them accordingly.
Yeah, that's quite a lot of work, right? So you have to keep in sync with the other projects. And but do you have like any distinct code and distribution that sometimes doesn't actually fit with some of these upstream changes?
Oh yeah, definitely. So that is like what github.com/K3sio K3s is. It's all of our code, but that code is sort of it is the code that packages and allows for the packaging, deploying, and operation of a K3s cluster. And so on top of just sort of pulling in the upstream, we're constantly putting fixes and features into the K3s code itself, which then effectively deploys Kubernetes. And not just Kubernetes, but we're also talking about traffic, which we bundle in as our ingress controller, etcd, like I said. So it's kind of a sprawling sort of packaging and deployment exercise.
Got it. And so for traffic, something like traffic, you also keep up with the upstream, I would imagine, right? So
yeah, as much as possible. I think one area that I think we need and want to improve is just with all of our components, getting in a really good cadence of staying fully up to date with them. For example, traffic had like a V2 release and it was out for a while before we adopted it into K3s. And it's just, like incompatibilities and things like that. So we wanted to be careful about how users would migrate. Our CNI is Flannel. And so that works really well for us because it's very, very simple. It's a very straightforward, simple use case CNI. It doesn't have a tons of bells and whistles, but several members of our team are now maintainers of Flannel, just because we just needed to help breathe some life into that project and help maintain it because it is important to us. And we embed Flannel directly into K3s as well and keep that updated too.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah. So features that we've that have landed, sort of these are the real big ones. Again, I've talked about it a couple of times, just enabling etcd for the HA scenario. That was a big lift because it's not just simply saying we support etcd. Like we manage the etcd cluster. So we're managing quorum as server nodes are added and dropped from the cluster. We're managing the etcd cluster as well to ensure it stays up and has quorum. And then snapshotting and restoring features go hand in hand with that, to ensure safe rollback and that sort of thing. A big thing that has been our focus is SE Linux support, not only for K3s, but for Containerd. This was the year prior when we introduced it, but we worked with the upstream Containerd community to, get SE Linux support into that container runtime, because prior to that, it's really, Cryo was the main place you could get SE Linux support at a container runtime level. Another big one was air gap support, because so many of our use cases are on, devices that have either limited or no internet connectivity. And we always had an air gap story, but improving that to make it sort of a better user experience for folks in that scenario. Some of it was simple stuff like having a better compression algorithm for our tarball and that sort of thing. Traffic, I talked about C groups v2, support some performance and reliability improvements in that DB shim layer. We put a lot of effort into basically evaluating and ensuring we have conformance with the Kubernetes CIS hardening guide. So that's, CIS is a body for sort of security related things, and they have a hardening guide for Kubernetes. Not all of those apply to K3s because, you know, they're very specific, you know, make sure this particular file has this particular set of permissions. And a lot of those things are what K3s does in sort of I guess, a custom or unique way. And then again, just talking about releases, there's many more fixes, enhancements, and features across like 40 or some odd releases since last October. So this is just kind of looking forward, things I want to do, I should say. And I broke this again into sort of the keeping our house in order type stuff, and then feature type stuff. So we want to continue to improve and expand on automated testing, going as far as having, you know, automated nightly builds, or sorry, yeah, nightly builds and testing to kind of catch things more quickly. We're due for sort of a documentation overhaul. You know, a lot of K3s's independent documentation is in, you know, just the README and, you know, kind of scattered through the repo. There's more formalized documentation on rancher.com, but obviously that's tied to Rancher. And so we want to, you know, ensure we have sort of full and comprehensive documentation completely independent of Rancher or SUSE. Build and release improvements. So just to keep up with the sheer volume of releases we need to do, there's a ton of automation improvements we can do here to make it more reliable, quicker, less human steps in it. So there's less chances for mistakes.
A question. So are you working with the, I assume you're already working with the upstream Kubernetes community, traffic, and containerd, so that maybe you can improve on some of the automation when some of the new patches or releases actually come out, and basically make it less human, right? So more automatic.
Yeah, honestly, from the release standpoint, we don't. So for like containerd and traffic, for example, those are smaller projects, and we sort of have more direct relationships with some of the maintainers. Kubernetes is the one where I think we need to get more involved and just kind of understand how we can leverage some of the things they've already done. And that's actually was just in conversations we were having recently, like looking at their test grid infrastructure and if it would make sense for us. So I would say direct interaction with the upstream Kubernetes release team. We don't have a ton of direct interaction. We're mainly like watching as they release and then reacting to it.
Mm-hmm. Do you have plans to have a more direct interaction? Like, I think it might be helpful when it comes to like the next stages.
Absolutely, yeah. And that's encompassed by my last bullet point. As I kind of had a hard time wording that, but just in general, improving and expanding the interaction with upstream. So, you know, one thing we want to try to do, I don't know if it will fly or not, but we've kind of just started the early work on figuring out how we could do this, is seeing if upstream Kubernetes is interested in kind, you know, to allow Kubernetes in general to use different databases. Mm-hmm. A lot of our other patches, honestly, I think are sort of like kind of suspect they won't be accepted, but we still should go through the effort of putting them up there. But they're kind of just very specific to K3s's opinion on things. And then, you know, hopefully using these as sort of like a jumping off point to get more tightly into that world, basically. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Yeah. I would imagine there's some little bit of politics involved there too. With working with maybe Kubernetes wants to do it one way, and mm-hmm. K3s needs to do it a different way. So it might take a little bit of time, right? But
yeah.
But I think maybe if you keep persistent, then things will work.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's the big thing, is just keeping the persistence and the focus on it, and you know that always gets balanced. You know, like the challenge is always balancing that against shipping, for lack of a better term. Yeah, and then the other bullet point I haven't talked about here is just continuing on those contributor quality of life improvements, contributor docs. We have a contributing.md, but I think we could go a lot further to help people get started with working on K3s, right? Because it's kind of complicated to get a development environment set up for it and know if you're doing the right thing. So more effort there, I think, would help folks get into it. Again, in line with sort of leveraging what other projects have done, sort of, more bots, leveraging other bots that sort of, like Kubernetes has a great suite of bots for doing what it needs to do, but it's specific to the way Kubernetes does things, which is not exactly how we do process management. But in general, we're kind of hoping to rely more on bots to move processes along and issues along, that sort of thing. Okay, I'm gonna jump to features now. So this is sort of our feature goal set. I think I wouldn't necessarily say this encompasses the entire next year, but it's sort of what's on our like midterm roadmap. As I mentioned before, K3s's CNI is flannel. You can turn off flannel and then you're on your own. You can basically just, figure out how to deploy a different CNI. We've seen enough requests for sort of more first-class CNI so that you can, for example, just, as part of the K3s arguments, -- CNI equals, Calico or equals Cilium, so that you don't have to bring your own effectively. More and more requests for IPv6 dual stack support. So we've already put some effort into enabling that, just kind of like making sure the raw Kubernetes bits work, and then working on getting IPv6 support into flannel, and then, ensuring it works for our other components like traffic and our service load balancer, that sort of thing. K3s sees sort of a lot of interest from the telco space, and the telco space needs SRIOV support. I cannot claim in any way to be an expert on SRIOV, but it allows for sort of, closer to the hardware networking, I think is the 10,000-foot view. And it sits next to a more traditional CNI. So the deployment scenario we've seen with that is like Multis plus something like Calico, and then as a secondary CNI, SRIOV. We always have our eye on security and compliance issues. So we're always staying on top of sort of SE Linux support things as they come up. FIPS is a cryptography validation standard for the US government. We expect K3s to have an answer there sometime in the next, in the next year. Automating just the scanning and revving of our base images, because K3s is a binary, but ultimately it deploys a number of components as pods inside of the cluster. And so ensuring we have a process in place to scan those and automatically update them for CVEs. The replacement for from a security perspective, the replacement for PSPs is on our radar, and ensuring when it drops, we properly support it in K3s. And then I mentioned we already did some work around CIS, but we'd like to have sort of, a hardening guide that is more custom to K3s and takes into account like, oh, well, there are these additional config files, there's the process runs in this different way, and just really going to the next level of outlining how to harden K3s specifically.
It's the current CIS standard that you're following, the more like the Kubernetes, the upstream Kubernetes one? Or?
Right, is the upstream one. And so sort of in our documentation where we talk about it, it's like, we just go through point by point and say, this one doesn't apply to K3s because it doesn't have that process or because it doesn't have that file. But I think we could go to the next level and say, in addition to those things that don't apply, here's a whole swath of things that are unique to K3s that do need to be considered. So yeah. We always have an ever expanding support matrix as new operating system flavors come up, and generally one of the claims we like to make is K3s will run on any modern Linux operating system, but as those operating systems just have their own take on upgrades or just maintaining the file system, we have to kind of always keep that in mind and keep an eye on what we can support. Excuse me. And then more speculative features or enhancements that I think we might get into over the next year is an embedded registry solution. So again, going back to air gap or just limited connectivity, making sure you can kind of bootstrap a cluster and the images you need are there and available and don't go away, don't get like garbage collected or anything. Tiny edge integration, tiny edge meaning like devices, right? So edge is a very broad term, and K3s is already well positioned for sort of like a kiosk or a rack inside of a branch store. But where other projects do more is for that, integrating with cameras or other sensors. We have our eye on Akri from, I think Microsoft announced it a while ago, and want to make sure we have a good integration story there. And then finally, support for Windows. We've seen that getting more and more popular, more and more interest. And so, that'll be an effort to ensure K3s can launch Windows workloads on Windows nodes.
Did you have anything on the roadmap to support something like cross-led or being able to run some WebAssembly type of modules, or that's not yet in the roadmap?
No, I wouldn't say it's directly on our roadmap.
Okay. All right. That's some other a different area to explore in the future.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. Cool.
Yeah, that is what I had as far as slides to present. Any questions or anything? And Hussein or Brian, is there anything like I missed that you'd want to bring up?
No, I think you covered everything pretty well.
Yep.
All right. Thank you. Anybody else has any other questions? Let's see, Philippe. I see.
I think, yeah, Chris is with Chris, Brian, and Hussein are all here to support me as well.
Yeah, no, it's all good work, and it's nice to see that working across architectures and platforms. It's actually good to see that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Philippe is from ARM, so
awesome.
they appreciate support for ARM.
Yeah, and generally for that, projects are not just for one architecture or another. It's actually that it's easy to work across the board, and it's not anything too biased in there, which is good.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I couldn't agree more.
And it makes it easier for the project to maintain longer term. So I think it's anything, even for new projects, when people have that in mind, I think it's all the better for the future.
Yep.
Are you working with some of the AWS instances that they have the Graviton instances that support ARM? So do you have any tests of those yet, or not yet?
That's where we do some of our ARM. So our ARM testing is either in AWS on the ARM node there, or on devices, smaller devices type computers that are running ARM. That's the two primary ways we test ARM.
Okay.
And ARM ARM v7, ARM v8, or if you want to say ARM 32-bit versus 64, like ARM v8, works pretty much seamlessly. And I would say we run into issues with ARM v7 every several months, just something wacky will happen, and it's not necessarily ARM's fault, but just a combination of Go and ARM. We just hit weird, wacky problems and kind of end up burning burning a developer week, just trying to figure out what broke and why.
Yeah, I think it goes back to what I raised earlier, which is that some projects or developers don't always keep in mind that it has to work across the board. But yes, and you'll find a lot of ARM in Edge and smaller form factor platforms, right? So which I think K3s is a good candidate.
Yep, exactly.
All right. Well, thank you, Craig. Thank you, SUSE team. That's been great, and looking forward to seeing progress in the project, and hopefully soon have something for incubation. And with the tag, we'll be here for any help. And also, if you want to, think about getting a group of people together, the working group option is always open.
Yeah, did you, my mention of sort of the edge space and that tiny edge space, would you say, is there a different tag that is more appropriate for sort of, I guess, if we were interested in being part of an edge working group? I'm sure that it probably already exists somewhere.
Well, it's basically TAG-Runtime under the CNCF. So for cloud native type of applications, there is the Linux Foundation has something called I think it's called AI and Edge or something.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's broader. It's not specifically targeted for cloud native.
Mm-hmm.
So it is TAG-Runtime for cloud native, but if you want something more specific, I mean, what I mentioned is you can have Edge working group or something like that, right? Where people want to work in that space.
Cool.
And,
that's cool.
And the idea is to maybe come up with some charter and a common set of problems, the challenges that are in the industry, and people are interested in that and tackling the problems, right? And by creating an open source project or some sort of specification or standard.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Yeah, I'll have some conversations internally, and then probably reach out to you just to talk about get more details on kind of kicking off a working group or something.
Sounds great.
Yeah, there is an Edge and IoT working group within the CNCF you can also check out.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. All right. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks.
See you next time. We usually upload these presentations on the CNCF on our TAG-Runtime channel. So if you want to share this presentation, you can do so later too.
Okay, we'll do.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Bye. Bye.